28,000 years before Christ, in the limestone caves overlooking the river Bend, Kara pressed her ear against her 4-year-old daughter Ava's chest, counting each labored breath as the child's ribs showed sharper each day. One might think that after 7 generations of successful habitation, the Riverbend clan would have developed some sort of contingency plan. One would be wrong. The clan of 23 souls had done rather well for themselves, all things considered. The men hunted mammoth and reindeer with admirable efficiency. The women gathered berries and roots with practiced ease. Everyone knew their role in what they called the great dance of survival, though dance seems rather generous for what was essentially a desperate scramble to avoid being eaten or starving to death. Still, the system had worked perfectly well until, inconveniently, it did not. This year, the herds left 3 weeks early. Not a week, not 2 weeks. 3 entire weeks before anyone expected them to depart, as if the reindeer had checked some sort of prehistoric calendar and decided to revise their migration schedule without consulting the humans who depended on them. The strange cold winds brought frost in early autumn, and the herds, displaying considerably more sense than their hunters, fled south. Chief Toruk, scarred from 30 winters of leadership and presumably still learning, sent his best hunters further each day. They returned with empty hands and hollow eyes, which was becoming something of a pattern. One imagines the daily reports grew tedious. Any luck? No. Tomorrow then. Perhaps. Repeat for weeks. The shaman Gorak, when consulted on this predicament, threw the oracle bones and declared the spirits angry. This was his professional assessment, arrived at through rigorous mystical analysis. The spirits, apparently, demanded more offerings. That the clan had nothing left to offer did not factor into the spirits' pricing structure. Gorak was quite firm on this point. The spirits wanted what they wanted, and if the clan happened to starve while attempting to appease them, well, the spirits would presumably find that very satisfying indeed. While the hunters argued in council about where the herds might have gone, as if prolonged debate would cause mammoth to materialize, and the shaman painted new prayers on the cave walls with what one suspects was misplaced confidence in the seed. Power of interior decoration. Kara noticed something others dismissed. The ground squirrels were growing impossibly fat. Their cheek pouches bulged with seeds that no human ate. This observation might seem unremarkable, but consider the context. Everyone else was watching the horizon for herds that would not return, consulting bones for answers they would not provide, and painting walls in hopes of divine intervention that would not arrive. Kara was watching squirrels. In the grand hierarchy of hunter-gatherer focus, this ranked somewhere below watching grass grow. Yet here she was, a 31-year-old woman who had already lost 2 children to previous famines, finding the squirrels far more interesting than the council meetings. She followed these creatures to their caches. What she found were acorns, grass seeds, and strange hard kernels that even starving wolves ignored. The wolves, it should be noted, had standards. They were hungry enough to consider eating each other, but these seeds? Absolutely not. This should perhaps have given Kara pause. It did not. That night, as her daughter whimpered from hunger cramps and her husband Bren spoke quietly of which elder might walk into the snow, a euphemism that fooled absolutely no one about its true meaning, Kara made her desperate decision. She would break the oldest taboo. She would eat what the spirits had marked as animal food. That the spirits had marked it thus by making it completely inedible was apparently a detail she chose to overlook. The first experiments happened in secret, behind the boulder where women went for moonblood isolation. Privacy was apparently the least of her concerns. Kara heated the bitter acorns on flat stones, crushed them with river rocks, and mixed them with water. Each attempt ended with cramping stomachs and violent retching, which most people would interpret as nature's way of saying, "Stop this immediately." Kara interpreted it as a need to refine her technique. Then came the fever dream. Whether sent by desperation or divinity remains an open question, though desperation seems the likelier sponsor. In this dream, she saw herself as a squirrel, storing seeds not in the ground but in clay vessels, transformed by fire into something new. When she woke, her sister wife Mira was sponging her forehead, whispering of the strange words Kara had spoken about cooking the earth itself. Most people, upon waking from a fever dream in which they imagined themselves as a rodent engaged in ceramic arts, would perhaps lie down until the feeling passed. Kara, however, took it as instruction. She would cook the earth itself. The fact that this made no sense whatsoever did not deter her in the slightest. After all, everything else they had tried, the hunting, the praying, the bone-throwing, the wall-painting had produced exactly nothing. Why not try the fever dream of a starving woman who had recently poisoned herself with acorns? What could possibly go wrong? In the grey dawn, while hunters slept, presumably dreaming of mammoth that would never return, Kara and Mira crept to the riverside clay beds where children played at making toy animals. The irony of adults sneaking about to engage in what was essentially advanced pottery class, while their menfolk slumbered in blissful ignorance of culinary innovation, was apparently lost on no one but the participants themselves. Kara shaped something unprecedented. Not a toy mammoth. Not a decorative figurine of the sort that archaeologists would later discover and solemnly declare ritual objects because they could not fathom any practical purpose. No. Kara made a deep vessel with thick walls, decorated with the sacred spiral pattern to appease any watching spirits. One imagines she hedged her bets. If the spirits were going to be angry about the rule-breaking, perhaps attractive dishware would soften the blow. The firing took 3 attempts. The first vessel cracked immediately, which was discouraging. The second crumbled into dust, which was more so. But the third held strong, ringing like stone when tapped, which must have seemed rather miraculous given that the first 2 had performed more like elaborate mud sculptures subjected to heat. Kara had accidentally invented ceramics, though she probably thought of it more as getting the cursed clay to finally cooperate. Inside this crude pot, Kara placed bitter acorns and water, setting it near but not in the fire. This was a technique she had seen used for boiling water with hot stones, though never for food transformation. The distinction is important. Boiling water was normal. Attempting to chemically alter the fundamental nature of inedible seeds through sustained heat application was decidedly not normal. It was, in fact, the sort of thing that got one labelled a witch, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Hours passed, the water bubbled, and slowly, miraculously, the bitter tannins leached away, leaving nutty sweet mush that stayed down when eaten. Kara had discovered cooking. Well, more accurately, she had discovered advanced cooking. Humans had been applying fire to meat for quite some time. But this was different. This was chemistry. This was understanding that heat plus time plus water could transform poison into food. That she had no concept of tannins or chemical bonds or molecular structures made the achievement no less remarkable, and possibly more so. Word of Kara's experiments reached the suspicious ears of Toruk's younger wife, later. 1. Might wonder how such carefully concealed experiments became common knowledge. The answer, as it has been throughout human history, was gossip. Women talk. Women had been talking for millennia, and while Kara had been clever enough to hide her location, she had apparently not accounted for the fact that Mira told her cousin, who told her sister wife, who told later, because humans are fundamentally incapable of keeping revolutionary discoveries to themselves. Later's jealousy of Kara's still-living daughter curdled into accusations of witchcraft. This was not entirely surprising. In a society where children died with distressing regularity, having a child who lived was almost suspicious. Having a child who lived while others starved was practically an admission of supernatural intervention. That Later's own children had died from perfectly natural causes, starvation being rather democratic in its victims, did not prevent her from seeking someone to blame. Kara, with her strange fever dreams and earth cooking and general refusal to accept death gracefully, made an excellent target. The confrontation exploded during the evening gathering. Lita threw the crude pot into the central fire, declaring Kara possessed by evil spirits who made her eat cursed food. The pot, having survived the firing process, survived this as well, which rather undermined Lita's point about it being cursed, but did nothing to diminish her fury. Chief Toruk, caught between tradition and desperation as his own youngest son grew weaker by the day, faced a decision. He could side with tradition and likely watch his son die. Or he could side with the woman who claimed to cook earth and possibly watch everyone die of spiritual contamination. These were his options. Neither was ideal. He ordered a trial by demonstration. If Kara's method could feed the clan for 3 days without sickness, she would teach everyone. If anyone fell ill, she would be exiled to die alone in the frozen waste. This was, all things considered, a rather fair trial by the standards of a society that regularly sent elderly people to walk into the snow. Still, the stakes were clear. 3 days, no illness, or death. The trial transformed into theatre. One imagines the entertainment value was considerable in a society whose usual evening activities consisted of staring at fire and telling the same stories their grandparents had told. Now they had live experimental cookery with life or death stakes. The entire clan watched Kara work, grinding seeds on flat stones in circular motions that would echo through millennia, though at the time probably just seemed like watching someone rub rocks together for hours on end. She mixed the flour with water and herbs, Mira gathered, forming flat cakes that hardened near the fire into something that smelled like spring itself. This was perhaps the cruelest part of the trial. The aroma of baking bread, humanity's first experience of it, filling the cave while starving people watched and waited to see if it would kill them. Children pressed close, saliva flooding their mouths, while Leta and Gorak stood apart, whispering of spirits and curses. The shaman and the jealous wife made natural allies, both having much to lose if Kara succeeded. Day 1 passed. No one died. Day 2 passed. Still no deaths. This was promising, but not conclusive. Poison could be slow-acting. The spirits might be gathering their strength for a truly impressive smiting. Leta and Gorak waited with what one imagines was poorly concealed hope for divine intervention of the fatal variety. On the third dawn, with 23 souls still breathing and bellies finally quiet from fullness not hunger, even skeptics could not deny the evidence. Kara's impossible trick had worked. The earth could be cooked. Seeds could be eaten. Starvation could be postponed, possibly indefinitely. This should have been the end of the story. It was not. Gorak, watching his authority crumble like old bone, declared one final test. The clan must survive the entire winter on this new food, or the spring survivors would cast out anyone who had eaten it. This was, to be clear, moving the goalposts. The trial had been 3 days. 3 days had passed successfully. But Gorak was a shaman, and shamans do not maintain authority by gracefully accepting when their prophecies prove incorrect. They maintain authority by declaring new prophecies with new conditions until something finally kills enough people to prove them right. The clan faced a choice: trust the seeds through the longest winter, or cling to tradition and hope the herds returned. That the herds had already demonstrated their complete indifference to human hope did not factor into the traditionalists' calculations. Hope, after all, costs nothing. Right up until it costs everything, winter was coming, and with it, the real test would begin. As the first true blizzard sealed the cave entrance with snow taller than 2 men, the clan split into 2 camps. 14 souls followed Kara in gathering and preparing seeds. 9 clung to tradition, accepting starvation over spiritual contamination. That the traditional approach had already failed, rather spectacularly, did nothing to diminish its appeal to those who found comfort in familiar methods of dying. The division was not merely philosophical, it was geographical, social, and deeply personal. Families split, brothers stopped speaking. The cave itself divided into seed-eaters and meat-waiters, with an invisible but absolutely tangible line running down the middle. On one side, the constant grinding of stone on stone. On the other, the sound of stomachs growling and bones being thrown repeatedly in hopes of different answers. Kara organized her followers with the precision of a master hunter coordinating a mammoth kill. This was rather ironic, given that she was doing the precise opposite of hunting, but the organizational principles translated surprisingly well. Young boys who had never made a successful hunt became expert seed gatherers, their small fingers perfect for extracting grain from dried grass heads. One imagines their fathers found this emasculating. Their fathers were also starving, so their opinions on masculine dignity carried somewhat less weight than they might have under better-fed circumstances. Teenage girls took shifts, maintaining the sacred fire that could never die. This was not metaphorical. If the fire died, the cooking stopped. If the cooking stopped, the seeds remained poison. If the seeds remained poison, everyone died. The pressure on these girls to stay awake and keep adding fuel was therefore somewhat considerable. One imagines they developed a profound appreciation for the responsibility, while simultaneously resenting every moment of it. The elderly, no longer burdens waiting to die, became grinders and storers. This was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Kara's system. In the traditional hunting economy, old people with failing eyesight and weak limbs were liabilities. They consumed resources without contributing to the hunt. They were loved, certainly. But love does not fill bellies. In the seed economy, however, their lifetime of experience judging which foods would last and which would spoil became invaluable. They could sit and grind for hours. They knew seasons and storage. They were, quite suddenly, essential. That this new economic model accidentally invented respect for the elderly was probably not Kara's primary goal, but one takes progress where one finds it. The work was harder than any hunt. This bears repeating because it contradicts rather thoroughly the romantic notion of agriculture as humanity's great leisure revolution. 18 hours of labor to produce enough flour for one day's eating. 18 hours of grinding, sifting, mixing, cooking, and storing. A successful mammoth hunt might take 3 days but could feed the clan for weeks. The seeds fed them, daily, and demanded daily labor in return. Hands bled from grinding, backs screamed from bending, eyes stung from smoke. But Ava's strengthening giggle and the roses returning to hollow cheeks drove them forward. Meanwhile, across the invisible line, the traditionalists waited, and waited, and grew thinner. Chief Toruk, despite having authorized the trial, had not joined the seed-eaters. He was caught in an impossible position. As chief, he could not be seen to abandon tradition without losing all authority. As father, he watched his son waste away. As human being, he presumably noticed that the seed-eaters looked substantially healthier than his own faction. These observations created what philosophers would later call cognitive dissonance, and what Toruk probably just called agony. Then came the night when Leta, crawling on her belly, tried to scatter the stored flour into the wind, screaming about appeasing angry spirits. This was, even by the standards of desperate acts, remarkably stupid. The spirits, if they existed and if they were angry, had shown no particular interest in flour one way or another. Leta's real motivation was considerably more earthly. If everyone starved equally, her dead children would be in good company. If some lived while others died, her loss became unbearable. Better universal death than selective survival. It was the logic of grief, which is to say, no logic at all. The clan might have torn apart entirely at this moment. Half-starved people watching their stored food, their only hope of survival being deliberately destroyed, might reasonably have responded with immediate and terminal violence. But young Daru, Chief Toruk's favoured son, collapsed from starvation while Leta still had strength to sabotage. The timing was exquisite in its cruelty. Here was the chief's son, dying from pride. Here was the proof that tradition killed. In that moment, Toruk made his choice. He carried his unconscious son to Kara, begging for the food he had once called cursed. One imagines the walk across the cave, across that invisible line, cost him more than any hunt ever had. Chiefs do not beg. Chiefs do not admit error. Chiefs certainly do not prostrate themselves before women who break taboos. But chiefs also do not watch their sons die when salvation sits 20 paces away, smelling of baked grain and possibility. Kara fed the boy. She could have refused. She could have demanded concessions, apologies, public admissions of error. She did none of these things. She simply fed him, because feeding starving children was apparently what she did, regardless of politics. Daru lived, and with his survival, the transformation was complete. The remaining traditionalists crossed the line. Gorak, his authority shattered beyond repair, stopped throwing bones and started grinding seeds. Even Leta, her sabotage foiled and her arguments exhausted, took up a grinding stone with hands that shook from more than hunger. The clan reunified, but not as it had been. The hierarchy had shifted, the power structure had crumbled and rebuilt itself around different principles. Meat still mattered, but seeds mattered more. Hunters still held respect, but grinders held survival. And Kara, who had started the winter as a desperate mother breaking taboos, ended it as something else entirely. She held no title. Toruk remained chief, but everyone knew where the real power lay. It lay with the woman who could cook the earth. Then came the night that would enter clan mythology. The Bone River clan, 20 strong warriors who had raided River Bend for generations, attacked during the deepest cold. They expected to find weakened prey hoarding the last scraps of dried meat, easy victims for quick plunder. They had not received the latest intelligence regarding dietary innovations. Instead, they met fighters sustained by steady nutrition. Women who could swing grinding stones as weapons with arms strengthened by months of constant labor. Children healthy enough to raise the alarm rather than lying listless in the back of the cave. The raid was a disaster. The Bone River warriors retreated in confusion, spreading tales of River Bend's mysterious winter strength. That the strength came from seeds rather than sorcery probably would have disappointed them. Humans generally prefer magical explanations to mundane ones. The truth that River Bend had simply figured out how to eat grass was almost embarrassingly simple. By spring's first melt, when other clans counted their dead and prepared to honor those who had walked into the snow, all 23 River Bend souls emerged from their cave. They were thin. They were exhausted. Their hands bore permanent calluses from grinding. But they were alive. All of them. Every single one. In a winter that had killed perhaps 30% of the human population within traveling distance, River Bend had achieved zero mortality. This was unprecedented. This was miraculous. This was, more than anything else, impossible to ignore. The woman who dared to cook the earth had kept her people alive through the longest winter anyone could remember. And word was already spreading, carried by amazed scouts and defeated raiders, that something had changed at River Bend. Something that mattered. Something that would alter the course of human history. Though naturally no one involved had the faintest idea they were making history. They thought they were simply trying not to starve. Which, of course, was precisely the point. Spring brought delegations from 3 neighboring clans, their leaders swallowing pride to beg the secret of River Bend's survival. That these same leaders had spent generations raiding, scorning, and generally dismissing River Bend as unremarkable made their pilgrimages particularly satisfying to witness. One imagines Kara enjoyed the irony, though she was far too practical to mention it. There would be time for gloating later. First, there was the small matter of reshaping human civilization. Kara, now holding more real power than any woman in memory, possibly more than any woman in human history to that point, made a strategic decision. She would teach freely but retain mastery. Share the basic techniques, grinding, mixing, cooking, but keep the advanced knowledge about fermentation, storage, and seasonal timing within her matrilineal line. This was not mere selfishness. It was the invention of intellectual property, though she would have called it common sense. Give away everything, and power disperses. Give away enough to save lives while keeping enough to maintain influence, and one builds something lasting. The visiting chiefs, desperate men with hollow-eyed children, accepted these terms without negotiation. They had no leverage. Their people were dying. River Bend's people were demonstrably not dying. The mathematics of the situation required no complex calculation. Within 2 summers, the scattered clans began settling in permanent camps near reliable water and clay sources. They no longer needed to follow herds when the earth itself could feed them. That this meant abandoning a lifestyle that had worked for thousands of generations bothered them less than one might expect. Survival has a way of making people flexible about tradition. Kara established the Council of Grain, the first formal teaching system where knowledge passed from mother to daughter with the same reverence once reserved for hunt patterns. This was revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond mere agriculture. In the hunting economy, men held knowledge and power because men did the hunting. In the seed economy, Women held knowledge and power because women did the grinding, cooking, and most critically the teaching. The social implications would take generations to fully manifest. But the seeds were planted, if one will forgive the obvious metaphor. The social revolution ran deeper than mere survival. Women, as keepers of the seed knowledge, gained voices in councils. This was not granted graciously by enlightened men, it was seized by necessity. When the person who knows how to keep everyone alive speaks, sensible people listen regardless of gender. Women chose their own mates, no longer needing to attach themselves to successful hunters for survival. A woman with seed knowledge and grinding stones could support herself and her children. This made marriage optional rather than mandatory, which changed everything about courtship, family structure, and social organization. Men, freed from the constant pressure to provide meat or watch their families starve, developed new crafts, better pottery, because Kara's crude vessels were frankly embarrassing and everyone knew it. Permanent shelters, because moving camp every season made less sense when your food source did not migrate. Decorative arts that turned survival into culture, because humans with full bellies and idle hands inevitably start making things that serve no purpose beyond beauty. The birth of art and the birth of agriculture were not coincidental. They were causally linked. Beauty is a luxury of the well-fed. Kara's own daughter, Ava, grown strong on grain, became the clan's memory keeper. She painted the story of the Great Hunger and the discovery on the cave wall in ochre and charcoal, the first written recipe, encoded in sacred symbols that later generations would misinterpret as religious iconography. Archaeologists would eventually discover these paintings and solemnly declare them fertility rituals or hunting magic. They were, in fact, instructions. Step 1. Gather seeds. Step 2. Grind into flour. Step 3. Mix with water. Step 4. Cook. Step 5. Do not starve. The fact that this practical manual would be mistaken for mysticism says something rather unflattering about academic imagination, but that is a different story. The changes rippled outward. Villages formed around river bends model. Trade routes developed as people exchanged seed varieties, pottery techniques, and grinding methods. Population grew because well-fed women have more children who actually survive. Within 5 generations, the scattered bands of hunter-gatherers had transformed into settled agricultural communities with specialized labor, social hierarchies, and the beginnings of what would eventually become writing, mathematics, and organized religion. All because one woman refused to watch her daughter starve. In her 53rd winter, Kara sat surrounded by 47 grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the permanent village that had grown around the River Bend caves. The seasonal rounds continued, but now as choice, not desperation. Hunters still pursued game, but failure meant disappointed taste, not death. Gatherers still collected berries, but as supplements to the steady grain that filled storage pits carved into bedrock. The world had changed. The change was irreversible, and it had all started with a desperate woman poisoning herself with acorns behind a boulder. On her final night, Kara passed her original grinding stone, worn smooth as river rock from 25 years of use, to Ava. The stone had become sacred, though not in any mystical sense. It was sacred because it was the tool that had saved them all. She spoke words that would become humanity's first agricultural scripture, passed down through generations until they became ritual rather than instruction. We were hunters who learned to hunt the earth itself. We were followers who learned to lead the seasons. We were wanderers who learned to make the land wander to us. The poetry was probably added later. Kara likely said something more practical, like grind the seeds before they spoil, or keep the fire going. But humans prefer their foundational moments to sound profound, so the words were polished and refined until they achieved the proper gravitas. The sentiment remained true regardless. The impossible, cooking trick of one desperate woman had become the foundation upon which 10,000 years of civilization would rise. That Kara never intended to revolutionize human society, establish women's councils, or invent agriculture as a concept made the achievement no less remarkable. She had simply wanted to feed her daughter. Everything else, the pottery, the permanent settlements, the social restructuring, the birth of civilization itself, was accident and aftermath. But then, most of history's pivotal moments were accidents. Humans stumble into greatness with alarming regularity, usually while trying to solve considerably smaller problems. The herds never returned to their old patterns. The climate had shifted. The old ways were gone forever. But by the time anyone realized this, it no longer mattered. Riverbend and the communities it had spawned no longer needed the herds. They had learned to eat the earth. And in learning that, they had accidentally invented everything that would follow: cities, writing, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, art, architecture, and all the rest of what we call civilization. All because one woman had a fever dream about cooking clay and decided to take it seriously. One rather suspects she would have found the whole thing absurd, which, of course, it absolutely was.